Hello, hello, and welcome. Welcome to another story time brought to you by ABC Read and ABC Learn, in which we are here to help you develop and nurture that love of reading in every child as well as every adult. How are you all doing out there today? Evening, real early in the morning, real late at night, whatever time of day it is, whatever the weather is. I hope that you all are doing great. And I hope that you all have read or you're planning to read for at least 30 minutes. All right, all right. Well, we're about to get started, y'all, because I have such a phenomenal story that I want to read to you all. And before we get started with that awesome, inspiring story, I want to share with you all a short little excerpt from this book, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. And the reason why I want to share this with you all is because this right here, what I'm about to read, is the foundation of ABC Read and ABC Learn. And understanding that, just like Frederick Douglass said, once you learn to read, you will be forever free. Nobody can just tell you anything, because when you learn to read, you can go and read things and find out things for yourself. You can research stuff for yourself. And this was something that those who were enslaving our African ancestors, they understood that. This is why they forbade our enslaved ancestors from reading, from learning. They were tortured, they were beaten, all of that stuff. And right here, what I'm going to read to you all is, this is when that Frederick Douglass discovered that. The revelation came. He understood the power of learning how to read. Now, this is the part when the mistress, at first, she was teaching Frederick Douglass how to read. But then when her husband found out that this is what she was doing, he told her to stop doing that. He forbade her. He said, don't do that. And this is what he said. And this is coming from the slave master. If you teach that N-word, speaking of myself, how to read, there will be no keeping him. It will forever unfit him to be a slave. He would at once become unmanageable and of no value to his master. As to himself, it could do him no good, but a great deal of harm. It would make him discontented and unhappy. Now, this is Frederick Douglass speaking. These words sank deep into my heart, stirred up sentiments within that lay slumbering, and called into existence an entirely new train of thought. It was a new and special revelation, explaining dark and mysterious things with which my youthful understanding had struggled, but struggled in vain. I now understood what had been to me a most perplexing difficulty, to wit, the white man's power to enslave the black man. It was a grand achievement, and I prized it highly. From that moment, I understood the pathway from slavery to freedom. Okay? This came here from this book, which I highly recommend that you all read as well. And this is from chapter 6 of this book. All right? So right there, I wanted to share that with you all, because so you all, number one, again, so you all understand the foundation of ABC Read, which is our nonprofit, and ABC Learn, which is my tutoring business. And this is something that I'm always telling our young people, because for the most part, I'm reading to and tutoring children of African descent. And of course, unfortunately, you have children who are from the African American community as well as Hispanic and Latino communities who are doing poorly when it comes to reading. And in addition to that, they don't even want to read. But when you understand and when you read from this brother here, one of our ancestors, Frederick Douglass, and how he valued and prized reading, how he understood that this was the pathway to his freedom. And when we tell our children this, I believe this is one of the ways that we will get our children into reading and doing great when it comes to reading. So with that being said, now I'm ready to read this awesome story to you all right here. Amistad Rising, a story of freedom. The author, her name is Veronica Chambers, illustrated by Paul Lee. This story right here, this is based on a true story. I know there are some of you out there who are familiar with the story. There is actually a movie that was made. Debbie Allen was one of the producers, a phenomenal African-American woman who had helped to produce this movie. So they made a movie from this true story about Africans who decided that, no, you are not going to put us into slavery, and we will fight back. So I will begin. Stand here with me on the shores of New London, Connecticut. Feel the cool breeze of the Atlantic Ocean on your face. Feel the dirt beneath your feet. This land is far from ordinary. It was here, upon this very spot, that Joseph Singbe set foot in America, bringing with him a group of renegade slaves and leaving his mark on history. This is a story about the changing winds of fortune, about a man who was born free, was made a slave, and battled nations to be free again. It is a true story. And like so many stories, it begins not on land, but at sea. Have you ever wondered why the ocean is so wide? It's because it holds so much history. There's not a drop of seawater that doesn't have a secret. Not a river or a lake that doesn't whisper someone's name. Ask the ocean about the legend of Joseph Singbe, and this is what you might hear. The year was 1839. Owning slaves was still legal, although the stealing of slaves from Africa was not. Slavery was a huge business. Many slave traders had grown rich from selling human beings, and they were reluctant to give it up. It was nightfall when the slave ship Takora set sail from Sierra Leone, a small country on the coast of West Africa. The water rippled like quicksilver in the moonlight as the ship voyaged toward Cuba. But in the ship's hold, more than 500 Africans were held prisoner. There was no toilet, there was no bath, and the stench was unbearable. The Africans were chained together in pairs. Heavy iron shackles bound their hands and their feet. Movement was difficult. Escape was impossible. Disease and malnutrition claimed the lives of many. Others perished under the murderous beatings of the slave traders. The dead were tossed overboard without a thought. After 2 tempestuous months at sea, the Takora arrived in Cuba. There, 53 of the prisoners, including 4 children, were sold to 2 Spanish slave traders and forced to board yet another ship to take them to a Cuban plantation. This ship was called Amistad, the Spanish word for friendship. 3 days into the journey, the Amistad sailed through an unexpected storm. The ship was battered by roaring rain and wind. The trip took longer than the crew expected, and provisions were low. Each slave survived on a daily meal of 2 potatoes, a banana, and just a little water. In the hold of the ship, a young man tried to quell his unsettled stomach. Fear gripped him as he watched his fellow Africans suffer and starve. He was young and afraid, but destiny had a plan for him. His name was Singbe. Although the slavers had given him the Spanish name Joseph Singbe, he belonged to a group of people called Mende who lived near Sierra Leone. He had been working on a village road when he seized and sold to the slavers. When he was seized and sold to the slavers of the Takora. During the first 2 months of his captivity, Singbe was disturbed to find that he had begun to forget little things about Africa. The smell of freshly harvested rice, the color of the sunsets, the feel of wet grass beneath his running feet. When he closed his eyes, he could see these things only as distant and blurry as a dream. But he could never forget the people he had left behind, his wife, his 3 children, his mother and father. Every day, Singbe grew more restless, wondering what the Spaniards intended to do with him and the other Africans. Though they were forbidden to speak, his companions whispered questions. What lay ahead? What would slavery mean? Would they simply be transported from ship to ship indefinitely? Singbe had to find out. Occasionally, a few captives were allowed on deck for some air. Singbe waited for his turn, and when he was finally ushered above, he attempted to coax some answers from Celestino, the cook. The 2 men communicated with hand gestures, for neither spoke the other's language. Singbe demanded to know what would happen to them. Celestino smiled devilishly, intent on playing a cruel joke. He pointed to barrels of beef and signaled to Singbe that the slave traders planned to kill the Africans, cut them up, salt them for preservation, and eat them like cured beef. Fear and anger filled Singbe. He would not be eaten by the white men who held him captive. He would not. He decided to strike that night. With a loose nail he had found earlier in a deck board, he picked the lock on his shackles, freeing himself and then the other prisoners. Once free, they quieted the 4 children and searched the cargo hold. A box of sugarcane knives was discovered, a boon. Sneaking up to the deck, they took the crew by surprise. In the fight, Celestino, the captain, and 1 African were killed. 2 of the crew jumped overboard. 3 were taken prisoner. Singbe needed them to navigate the ship back toward Africa, back toward home. When the sun rose again, Singbe and his companions greeted the day as free people. But they had claimed victory too soon. Singbe ordered the Spaniards to steer the ship toward the rising sun. They obeyed and sailed the ship east toward Africa during the day, but then at night turned the ship around and sailed northwest toward North America. For 2 months, the ship pitched back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean. 9 more Africans died during that time, some from their battle wounds, some from food poisoning, and some from starvation. Then on August 27, 1839, the Amistad was escorted by an American ship into the harbor of New London, Connecticut. Weary, hungry, and hopelessly lost, Singbe and the others were forced to come ashore. An American naval lieutenant saw the possibility for quick profits in the Africans. But this was the North, and a group of whites and free blacks campaigning against the institution of slavery was gaining popularity. They called themselves abolitionists, and they took on Singbe and the other Africans as their most important case. The Africans were sent to prison in New Haven, Connecticut, until a decision could be made. The abolitionists managed to find a translator, and Singbe told his story in a U.S. court. He was only 25 years old, but his experience on the Amistad had given him the confidence of a much older man. The courtroom was crowded, and many were moved by Singbe's impassioned words. "I am not here to argue the case against slavery," Singbe said, "though I will say it is a sin against man and God. I am here to argue the facts. The indisputable international law is that the stealing of slaves from Africa is now illegal." "The men who kidnapped us, who beat and tortured us, were and are guilty of this crime," Singbe continued. "We are a peaceful people. We regret the loss of life caused by our mutiny, but we are not savages. We took over the ship to save our lives. We have done no wrong. Allow us to go home." The weekend before the judge made his decision, Singbe and his companions waited in the New Haven jail, their hearts filled with fear and hope. The judge held the power to make the Africans slaves or to set them free. On Monday morning, January 13th, 1840, they worried no longer. He had decided they should be returned home. They were free. But, as Singbe was soon to learn, the passage to freedom was as winding as the Amistad's journey across the sea. President Martin Van Buren, concerned that freeing the Mende would enrage Southern slaveholders, ordered the district attorney to file an appeal so the case could be heard in the U.S. Supreme Court. And because of this, Singbe gained his greatest American ally, former President John Quincy Adams. Having heard about the mutineers, Adams came out of retirement to argue Singbe's case. He was 72 years old. It had been more than 30 years since he had argued a case in a courtroom, and the thought of bearing the responsibility for this one worried the elderly statesman deeply. But inspired by Singbe, whom many of the abolitionists had begun to refer to as the Black Prince, Adams tirelessly prepared his defense. In court, he spoke on behalf of the mandate for 7.5 hours. Sweat poured from his brow, and his voice filled with the packed courtroom as he presented his case. There were many factors at play. Were the Africans the rightful property of the Spaniards? Were they brutal murderers? Or were they freedom fighters, no different than the men and women who had rebelled against England and founded the United States of America? There was also international pressure. Spain wanted the slaves, and the Amistad returned to Cuba. Could the United States risk provoking European ire over the lives of the 35 surviving Africans? After Adams made his closing arguments, the Supreme Court retired to deliberate. For Singbe and the others, the fearful process of waiting and praying began again. A week later, on March 9, 1841, the Supreme Court announced that Adams had prevailed. The Africans were truly free. It took 8 months for the abolitionists to raise the money for the Africans' long journey back to West Africa. But at last, the ship sailed, and when the African coast was finally in sight, Singbe gathered everyone together. "Let us give praise and thanks," Singbe called out, his voice booming across the deck. "By the strength of our spirit and with the assistance of our ancestors, we are not slaves today. Our children will not be slaves, and their children will not be slaves. We are exactly as God willed us to be. My brothers, my sisters, we are free." Savoring the word, he let it melt like sugar on his tongue. He paused and then tasted the word again. "Free," he said, more softly now. Each person aboard the ship felt the word coming up from their hearts, tasted the sweetness of it in their mouths, then released it into the salty sea air. "Free," they said in unison. "We are free." If you stand right here on the New London shore, you can hear the words of the great Joseph Singbe. His voice is so powerful that it travels across both space and time. If you bend down to the Atlantic, you can hear it in the beating of the waves. The wind whispers it as it blows around your head. And when the rain falls, it's like tears of happiness. You can hear his words almost anywhere you listen for them. We are free, free, free. free. The end. Well, you all, I hope that you all were inspired. I hope that you all learned a lot from this awesome, true story. And again, just to reiterate again what Frederick Douglass said in terms of once you learn to read, you will be forever free. And how making the connection with this book right here, with Amistad Rising, a story of freedom, and how Singbe, he understood what it meant to fight for your freedom. This is why they had the mutiny. This is why they had the uprising on that ship, because they knew what it was to be enslaved and they wanted no parts of it. So again, I hope that you all enjoyed that story, was inspired by the story, learned from that story. And I hope you all continue to like, subscribe, and share our videos. All right, so you all take care, and remember to keep reading for at least 30 minutes a day. Happy reading, family.